Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Nicola Casarini. Nicola is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, where he's working on a project titled U.S. and EU Perspectives on China's Trade, Financial, and Monetary Power Towards a Common Transatlantic Approach or Divergence. He raises the question. When not at the center, Nicola is a senior Asia fellow at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Nicola, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So, Nicola, I want to begin by asking you to characterize the current state of the relationships among the United States, China, and the EU. I've often had conversations over the last several years with Robert Daly from our Kissinger Institute, and we kept exploring the question, is it a Cold War yet? Is it a trade war yet? Where are we between the US and China? And of course, over the months, Robert's perceptions of where we stand have changed. I'd like you to begin by characterizing for us, what are we talking about? Are we talking about enemies, competitors, cooperators? What is the terms that would characterize the relationships?
Absolutely. I think you used the right term, Cold War. Cold War is something that we're having with China, even if we call it in different terms. Now, let's start with the United States. The United States have obviously identified China as the number one, let's say, competitor, if you don't want to use enemy for diplomatic reasons. When it comes to Europe, however, the situation is a bit more sophisticated in terms of China is indeed a big issue for Europe, but it's not an enemy. And just to give an example, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was in town a few days ago to meet Biden. But before coming to the United States, Angela Merkel made sure to send out two messages. The first one is that Europe and Germany, of course, does not want a Cold War between the United States and China. First point. But the second point, even more important for the United States, is that Angela Merkel said clearly that if the United States would push the European allies to choose between Washington and Beijing, Germany, and hence Europe, will not follow. So I think that's important because we're in a situation whereby for both Europe and the United States and China is a big issue, it's a big problem. However, the way they look at China and the way they think China as a potential enemy is quite different. That's why we need some transatlantic discussions here.
Well, you've written this piece that appeared in The Hill titled Congress and the European Parliament Must Work Together to Counter China. Before we discuss how possible that is, what is the current level of cooperation between those two bodies?
Between Europe and China?
No, between the European Parliament and the US Congress.
Well, that's the problem. That's why I sent out the piece, because we have now an emerging transatlantic dialogue on China supported by the Biden administration and, of course, the European Commission and national governments in Europe. However, the two legislatures are not present in this dialogue. We do have some cooperation agreement between Congress and the European Parliament, like some joint meetings sometimes. However, given the importance and the challenge provided by China, I think it is time to have an interparliamentary group between the US Congress and the European Parliament on China, a parliamentary group that will address China in particular. So that was my point, and I think this is the missing point. Remember that what differentiates China from the West is democracy. China is an authoritarian regime. That's why, imagine the symbolic importance to have the seat of democracy, US Congress in the United States, and the seat of democracy in Europe, national parliaments and the European Parliament to join forces to work on China. It would be a powerful message sent to authoritarian China.
Is there a precedent for such cooperation?
No, that's why I like the idea. Now, do I expect this cooperation to see the light today? No, it could take time. I think we need to go in that direction, especially if we have a discourse in China, which is so important. I mean, in the United States, every day you have something about China, and it is more and more like this in Europe too. So I think it is time that the two legislatures on the two sides of the Atlantic will get together and start the discussion. And on top of that, we also need, of course, transatlantic discussion at the level of civil society and think tanks. Just let me mention that here at the Wilson Center, we set up a transatlantic dialogue on China precisely because we feel that the understanding of China needs to go beyond just what the governments do and include as much as possible civil society and experts.
The point you made about the difference between the way the U.S. views China versus the way some of the European nations view China, is there a limit to how deep China's ties with the EU can become based on the authoritarian nature of its system?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, that's why we need more dialogue. I'll give you a couple of examples. China has been very good at supporting key European initiatives, such as Galileo, the European Space Satellite Network in the past, or supporting the Eurozone. When the Eurozone was under speculative attacks a decade ago, speculation that was coming mainly from Wall Street-based hedge funds and banks, China intervened in financial markets to support the Eurozone for strategic reasons. Now, we do have a big issue here. Europe has been, was born thanks to American support after the Second World War because of the Marshall Plan, NATO, etc. But in the last 2 decades, Europe has also become a competitor of the United States. And at key moments, China has been able to drive a wedge between the transatlantic allies by supporting key European initiatives that were not fully supported by Washington. So here we have an example that we can have Europe and China getting together, trying to do things together that could have important implications for the United States and weaken transatlantic ties. Absolutely, we do have quite a few issues that could happen along this line.
Which European countries, Nicola, have the closest relations with China currently, and has China's Belt and Road Initiative gained any traction in Europe?
Well, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, my country was the first and only G7 country to sign up for the Memorandum of Understanding with the Belt and Road Initiative. Italy did it in 2019. However, now with the new government by Mario Draghi, there's a repositioning of Italy more in line with the Euro-Atlantic. So we can say Italy to some extent, also for historical reasons. So we may remember the names of Marco Polo, etc. But I would say that today, the real driving force behind Europe-China relations is Germany. Germany is the most important trading partner of China in Europe. And a lot of German sectors depend on the Chinese market. So it means that for Germany, it's very difficult to take positions that are against the interest of its industry. So that's why it is a bit complicated. You have countries like Italy that are more and more for different reasons, they decided to get closer to China, Germany from an economic point of view, but also do not forget that some small member states also want to be seen at times closer to China. I'm thinking about Hungary. So Hungary sometimes uses relations with Beijing in order to send a message to Brussels. So again, we do have a kind of different dynamics going on in Europe when it comes to China. And that's why it is so difficult to reach a common position within the EU on how to deal with China.
So in your piece, you talk about one of the advantages that could be gained through more cooperation is to prevent unfair trade practices. I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of what that threat would look like. Are we talking about particular types of goods, particular types of technology, particular types of supply chains? Where might we see unfairness emerge if there isn't a unified front?
Well, we have a lot of examples here, but just to give you a few. Well, first of all, digital technologies would be an important one, 5G, etc., because they have also security implications. Now, China has been able in the past, through some companies like Huawei, for instance, to establish a foothold in Europe. But now we do know that these companies are requested by law and common practice in China to send information to Chinese security apparatus. So it is a serious risk for Europe and the transatlantic allies. So digital technology, 5G, would be an area. Another area would be common standards. Or in any case, I'll give you an example that was in the news in the past. We have forced labor that is used in China to produce some goods. So We may remember like the discussion about Xinjiang, like Europe and the United States put sanctions on the Chinese eastern province of Xinjiang because of like a forced labor and violation of human rights. Now, there are no common standards when it comes to regulate goods that come from, that are produced by using enslaved people, basically. So I think those are like a couple of like examples whereby we could have closer transatlantic cooperation and enforcement of common standards to make sure that certain goods coming out of China will not be sold in the West.
What does the situation look like between the EU and China when it comes to these human rights records? And the Uyghur population in particular has been in the news in recent years in terms of sanctions. What does that landscape look like currently?
It doesn't look very nice because for the first time, China imposed sanctions on European individuals and institutions. I mean, like they also imposed sanctions on some members of the European Parliament back in March. And that's the reason why an important agreement on investment between the EU and China was frozen a few months ago because of the sanctions. Now, the sanctions, in my opinion, might be lifted at a certain point because it is in Chinese interest to have this comprehensive agreement on investment between Europe and China to go ahead and to be finalized. However, it does send the message that China is taking tough positions vis-a-vis those that criticize human rights. And this is the common, I mean, this is like, something that we have to be clear in the West. We cannot give up on criticizing China. It's our duty. We are democracies. When we see human rights violations, and in the case of Xinjiang, they were pretty well documented, we have to act. We have to issue statements. We have to take action and impose sanctions. We do run the risk of Chinese retaliation, and this is a problem in particular for Europe, because Europe also has some small states that are increasingly dependent on China, and they do not want to annoy, to send unfriendly messages to China. That's why a transatlantic dialogue on China will also help not only the United States to find out how Europe is dealing with China, but also to put pressure coming from Washington and Brussels to some states, and I think here about Hungary, but could also be others, not to give up on criticizing China when it comes to fundamental human rights and democracy. So I think this is like something that will be one of the key issues in the future, how democracies, how Western democracies could still continue to criticize China and make sure that eventual retaliation coming from China against, in particular, some weak and small countries in the West will be offset by a countermeasure by the West. And that's why we need a united front, which I called it in the article, a Western united front to counter China.
Toward that end, are there leaders who are on the same wavelength as what you've proposed? Is there anyone who is willing to advocate for this level of cooperation?
I think most of the leaders in Europe, I'm thinking about, again, Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, has said it several times during the recent summits at NATO, the G7, etc. Macron, even Angela Merkel. I mean, like when I mentioned Angela Merkel criticizing or not being happy about the Cold War, does not mean that Angela Merkel does not agree with the fact that Germany and Europe need to make sure that China, when China violates basic human rights, is condemned. So I think that all of it, like European leaders, are in agreement with the United States when it comes to make sure that we remain in principle the nations. It's a degree. It is like when it comes to taking action that we may have problems. So luckily, in the case of Xinjiang, we were able to find a common ground and issue sanctions. It was not only Europe and the United States, also the UK, Australia, and other countries joined. But it could be difficult on other issues in the future. That's why this level of cooperation and coordination among democracies is more and more important nowadays.
Nicola, the joint statement that was issued by the US and the EU following the recent summit, largely devoted to China, either directly or indirectly. How significant was that?
It was very significant. It was the first time that I remember that the transatlantic allies spent so much time on China. Now, it also signals that China, as I mentioned before, is a big issue, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. Now, in the United States, it's a bit easier in a way because you have bipartisan consensus on thinking on like deciding to take some action against China. Senate passed like a huge like a competitive act bill some weeks ago. In Europe, we do recognize that China is a big challenge, but we still have some problems in reaching a common position, again, because there are 27 member states with different sensitivities, relations with China. So it is an issue. That's why, like, as in the past, hopefully, the more transatlantic dialogue we have, the more this could also help Europe to find a common and more principled position when it comes to China.
So where do we go from here? Your final thoughts on as you look ahead. Are there upcoming opportunities to increase this level of cooperation?
I think what like the future will have to have more discussion, as I mentioned at the beginning, between the two sides, the legislature, MPs, but not only civil society, experts, think tanks. We are thinking here at the Wilson Center also to do something more like long-term. So we set up this transatlantic dialogue in China, which sees like policymakers and experts from the two sides of the Atlantic. We would like it to become something for the long term that remains as a kind of an asset. Within the Wilson Center could also be an asset for like people in Washington, in Brussels and other European capitals to have an ongoing debate on China. I think that's what we need nowadays. China is a big issue. It should not be left to the care of governments only. It has to be more and more discussed in the legislature, in Congress, in Parliament. It creates more ties between the two and more among experts on the two sides of the Atlantic. I think this is like the challenge for the next months and years, to create a deep web of relationships between America and Europe, where they can discuss common projects on how to deal with China, to openly recognize their differences, but eventually at the end, to try to find a common front to deal with China.
Well, thank you, Nicola, for helping us sort through this complex topic. But before we sign off, if I can, I want to ask you a more personal question about your experience as a fellow at the Wilson Center. Have you found this useful to your work?
It is, I mean, the Wilson Center is quite unique in the world because you have this environment where you are engaged in serious research, but the ultimate objective, at least for me and many of my colleagues, is also to translate research into actionable ideas, into some concrete policy recommendations that can help, hopefully help the debate on important topics of the day. So I think that's why, like, what I like about the Wilson Center, this unique environment. And of course, we had a unique year, as we know, like a COVID, yes. But nonetheless, it is still a vibrant environment, even if it is done on Zoom, you can still get your ideas out. And that's what makes the Wilson Center a unique place.
Nicola Casarini, if you'd like to learn more about his work, you can come to the Wilson Center website and you can find a lot more under the Global Europe program. Nicola, thanks again. And to our viewers, thank you. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for being here.